Is it historically untenable to say that Christians have been pro-life from the beginning? Was the Southern Baptist Convention pro-choice until the 70s? Well, these are two claims that were made by James Talarico recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I wanted to take a few minutes to interact with those claims because they're ones that come up quite often in the progressive Christianity and deconstruction conversation. It's this idea that somehow we think that the Christian position is to be against abortion, but really that's just a modern invention. That's not something Christians always believed. But I hope to show you in today's episode that not only have Christians been pro-life from the beginning, they were quite specific about it and quite adamant about it. So let's go to this video with James Talarico.
And I think if we're looking at the last 40, 50 years, the religious right has made a concerted effort to make homosexuality and abortion the two biggest issues for Christians. And, the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the late 1970s. So this idea that to be a Christian means you have to be anti-gay and anti-abortion, there really is no historical, theological, biblical basis for that opinion.
Well, let's talk about this. First, this claim that the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the 70s. Well, it's true that the Southern Baptist Convention made certain caveats for abortion up until that time. But honestly, I think that's a bit of a distraction because ultimately, I don't really care what the Southern Baptist Convention did or didn't do before the 70s or after the 70s. What I'm interested in is the broader claim that's being made here, and that is ultimately that the pro-life Christian position is not one that can be defended historically. So I want to look through some history. But I also want to talk about this second claim that Christians have made abortion and homosexuality the primary issues of our day. I would like to suggest that Christians are merely responding to what culture has made the primary issues of our day. If you look back 50 years ago, when abortion became legal, Christians began to really speak out about it because there was a grave injustice being done to children in the womb. And yes, Christians talk about homosexuality a lot because sexuality really matters to God. And our culture has made homosexuality normative. So yes, we have to respond to that because these things matter. But let's first look back at a little bit of history. It can be tempting to think that we as modern Christians, like this, our moment in history is unique. No Christians have ever faced this kind of cultural pressure before. But the truth is we've been here before. We've been here many, many times. So Christianity was born into this first century Roman Empire context. This was a culture that held really radically different ideas about sex, marriage, and the value of human life. And the earliest Christians had to face these issues too, and they did not respond with cowardice. They didn't change their beliefs to fit culture. They didn't respond with hatred. They spoke truth and they loved their neighbors, but they remained faithful to Christ and what he taught. So let's start with someone who lived even before Christianity even began, and that's John the Baptist. So in Matthew 14 and Mark 6, John publicly challenged Herod's marriage to Herodias. So Mark 6:18 tells us this. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." So John wasn't put in prison just because he was religious. He wasn't arrested for just having these privately held beliefs. He was arrested because he publicly challenged the sexual ethics of a leader, of a ruler. So it was a marriage issue that landed John the Baptist in jail. In fact, Jewish historian Josephus gives additional background on this. In his Antiquities of the Jews, he writes this. Herodias took upon her to confound the laws of our country and divorced herself from her husband while he was alive and was married to Herod Antipas, I'm not sure. So John the Baptist actually paid for this conviction with his own life. So he was killed, just grasp this, for an issue speaking out about biblical marriage. So this is nothing new. From the beginning, God's people have faced opposition and persecution for proclaiming God's design about sexuality and marriage. But let's look into the culture that Christianity was born into. So there's a resource you must get. Everybody needs to read the book, Destroyer of the Gods by Larry Hurtado. So in this book, he describes Roman society as one in which sexual practices that Christians rejected were deeply embedded into just everyday life. So, what that looked like is men were generally expected to be sexually active outside of their marriages. Slavery provided nearly unlimited sexual access to people of lower status. Pornographic images appeared in homes, bathhouses, common household items. You'd have a vase sitting on a table that had a sexual act depicted on it. So, against that backdrop, Christianity taught something completely different and totally revolutionary. Sex was reserved for marriage. Marriage was between a man and a woman. And what was probably the most surprising for the ancient world is that men and women in the Christian standard were held to the same standard of sexual purity. So, whereas in the Roman world, men could kind of do whatever they wanted and women were expected to be faithful to their husbands, in the Christian world, men were held to that same standard of sexual purity. And of course, this is something that Jesus affirmed himself in Matthew 19. And Jesus said this in Matthew 19, verse 4 and 5. He said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So when Jesus spoke about sexual immorality, that phrase in English, sexual immorality, comes from a Greek word, porneia. And here's what Jesus says about this word in Matthew 15:19. He says, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander." So in that first century Jewish context, sexual immorality was kind of an umbrella term that referred broadly to any sexual behavior that was outside of God's design for marriage, which was marriage between a man and a woman. So the Christian sexual ethics were not an innovation. They weren't just something that people came up with. They were actually rooted in the teachings of Jesus himself. So Christians had a strong sexual ethic that we're not really saying anything different today. The Christians that are speaking out about things like homosexuality and fornication and casual sex, we are just upholding the words of Jesus. We're hearkening back to a more historical position, even though our culture has really changed quite a lot. Quick pause to tell you about a brand new sponsor, and I am so excited about this. This is our great friends from the Center for Biblical Unity and their Ambassadors for Biblical Justice program. You know, talking about topics like abortion reminds me that Christians should care about justice because God cares about it. It's one of his attributes. But a lot of things in our culture today are done in the name of justice that aren't just inconsistent with biblical principles, they actually go against the biblical definition of justice, like abortion being reframed as reproductive justice. Well, this is where the new program from Center for Biblical Unity comes in, Ambassadors for Biblical Justice. This is an alternative to progressive-leaning social justice ideology. It's so cool. It's a 9-month mentoring program that's going to train Christians to live out a scripture-rooted vision for justice. You're going to read books, you're going to get mentoring that is led by the leading Christian voices in biblical justice. You're going to gain practical tools to really make a difference in your community. Have you noticed that some of those conversations, especially around race and justice, get so hostile and so tense and even awkward? And all of this you're going to get from a historic Christian worldview, but it starts in August. So there's an application deadline of July 31st. So you can head on over to centerforbiblicalunity.com/ambassador. And if you just mention that you heard about this on my show, they're going to give you 15% off your tuition. Again, go to centerforbiblicalunity.com/ambassador. Fill out the application, take advantage of this amazing program that's truly going to help you bring change to your church, your community, your small group, your family. This is going to be so great. Centerforbiblicalunity.com/ambassador. Just mention on the application that you heard about it on my show for 15% off your tuition. So let's talk about abortion in the ancient world. As they actually go on to affirm in this Talarico Joe Rogan video, and I agree with them on this, that abortion was common throughout the ancient world. There were chemical abortions, there was infanticide, where if you had an unwanted child, you could leave it out to die, and that was perfectly socially acceptable. Sociologist Rodney Stark writes this: Once married, pagan girls had a substantially lower life expectancy, much of the difference being due to the great prevalence of abortion. I want to read you a quote from a book that is a really important book about how children were viewed in the ancient culture, and it's called When Children Became People. And it talks about how the value that was assigned to a person in that culture had to do with whatever perceived level of the logos they had. And that was like the center of reason. So here's a quote from this. It says, "From Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism onward, anthropological debates centered on speculations about the composition and function of the human person and the human soul. Here, the concept of logos, word, speech, reason, plays a central role." Now, here's the key part to understand about how the society viewed children and thus abortion. It goes on to say this: "It was the free male citizens who possessed the logos, and that was the presupposition for rational thought. Women and older men possessed it to some extent, or more correctly, they had the potential for logos, while slaves and barbarians definitely lacked it. Not surprisingly, children were classified along with the last group. The child symbolized the absence of logos, something reflected in the etymology of the word that designated children." And then there's a Greek word there. In Greek and infantes in Latin, that is, not speaking. Children's lack of the ability to communicate in an adult manner meant that they were defined as standing outside the rational world of adults. And the author goes on to talk about how even sometimes people wouldn't even name their children until they were 2 years old, just to see if they would make it. And they would not really even bond or connect with their kids because they weren't really viewed as fully human. So ancient abortion methods were dangerous, and women often suffered and even died because of these methods. And what's really, really striking is that Christians from the start stood against abortion from the earliest days of the church. So one of the oldest Christian documents we have outside of the New Testament is called the Didache, or is it Didache? I don't know. I've heard it pronounced both ways, but this was written near the end of the first century. And in it, and I would say this is an important document to read if you haven't read it. It's not very long. You can read it for free online. It's not a creed in the sense of like, here is the list of things we believe. It's not exactly like the Rule of Faith in the second century, where that's a summary of the teaching of the apostles, but it's a Christian document that was circulating about a way to live. This was kind of like our ethics, our morality. And it says this: "You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill what is begotten." Now, notice how early this is. This isn't from the Middle Ages. This isn't a later church development. This is first century Christianity. So I also mentioned that it was perfectly common and acceptable that if you had an unwanted baby, you could leave that baby out to die. Well, church historian Philip Schaff explains this. He says, "Christians resisted with all energy the exposure of children." So Christians constantly were rescuing these abandoned infants. And you know what happened? They actually impacted their culture. This is one of the ways that Christianity visibly changed and challenged Roman society. It's actually one of the reasons that early Christianity was so female heavy, because often the babies that were left out to die because they were female. But because Christians knew that every child has been made in the image and likeness of God, they rescued these babies right out of the garbage dump. So there's a really early Christian writing written somewhere between AD 70 and 132 called the Epistle of Barnabas. And here's a quote from that writing. It says, quote, "You shall not slay the child by procuring abortion, nor again shall you destroy it after it is born." There's another Christian philosopher and apologist named Athenagoras, I don't know how to pronounce Athenagoras, writing in the second century, and he wrote this, quote, "When we say that women who use drugs to bring on abortion commit murder and will have to give account to God for the abortion." Another Christian theologian, apologist that was writing in the second century is Tertullian, and here's a quote from his writings. He said, "It is anticipated murder to prevent someone from being born." So whether Christians were talking about abortion or infant exposure, they were amazingly consistent in the idea that humans were made in the image of God, that human life possesses inherent dignity, value, and worth. And that dignity, value, and worth doesn't depend on your age, ability, social status, or how much you're wanted or unwanted. And so what's amazing is that these convictions often placed these Christians at odds with their culture. Gerald Sitzer summarizes the Christian worldview this way, and here's a quote. He said, "The Christian worldview condemned infanticide, abortion, and incest, and disapproved of marital infidelity, divorce, and polygamy." So the Christian community practiced a way of life that passed judgment on the culture, not merely just through their words, but just through their existence. And I think this is such an important lesson for us today. The early Christians weren't just persecuted merely because they worshiped Jesus. They were persecuted because their allegiance to Jesus shaped how they lived, and the culture didn't like that. So their beliefs had public consequences. They didn't feel like they could just keep their beliefs about morality private. Maybe they would be called culture warriors today. I don't know. But Jesus warned his followers in Luke 9:26. He said, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in glory." So notice that Jesus is saying, not only me, but of my words. We are, as Christians, not to be ashamed of Jesus' words. So following Christ means following his teachings, even when those teachings become unpopular, as they are now. So is the Christian position on abortion historically justifiable? Not only is it justifiable, it's the only one. And to claim otherwise is to betray a breathtaking ignorance to Christian history.